Okay. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar hosted by AusCham and also by Asia Counsel and also by Domicile Corporate Services as well. Today we're going to talk about the labour law and work permits and residency updates and changes for 2021. The seminar today will be discussing upcoming changes due to the introduction in Vietnam of the new labour law changes, to the issuance and eligibility of work permits and the work permit exemptions. The discussion will be around existing practices for temporary residence cards, business visas due to current border disruptions as well. Your speakers are Minh Duong, who's partner at Asia Counsel, and Matt Lourey, who's the managing partner for Domicile Corporate Services. The seminar is designed to provide a practical discussion of the changes in both laws and provide clarity on processes and the requirements for authorities. There'll be opportunities at the end of the presentations for all participants to join in the Q&A session, so make sure you please have some available. There's a Q&A box on the webinar Zoom site, so please use that and send those at any time during the discussion. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Minh Duong, who's partner at Asia Counsel and current President of AusCham in Vietnam. Minh is a lawyer and has been admitted to the New South Wales Supreme Court and High Court of Australia and a registered foreign lawyer in Vietnam. He has over 12 years of experience advising international and Vietnamese clients to grow their businesses in Vietnam. He specialises in M&A, corporate and commercial, capital markets, securities law, banking and finance. Minh is actively involved in AusCham and has been previously a director over the past 4 years and secretary. So without further ado, I'd like to give the presentation across to Minh.
Thanks very much, Simon, for your introduction. I also want to acknowledge first Domicile Corporate Service for their sponsoring of this event today. It's a great effort. We've Domicile have done this event over the past 3 years, and it's great that we get an annual update on labour, work permits, and visas. So my part of the presentation will be mostly on the labour law changes that's going to come into effect on 1st January 2021. I'm going to open my share screen. Just to share with you my slides, presentation slides today. So Simon, you can see my slide, right? My share screen.
Yes.
Great. Okay, there might be some interruption. I'm actually working from home in Sydney at the moment, so you might hear Peppa Pig and the normal interruptions. So please bear with me if that happens. So the new labour code will be effective from 1st January 2021. And that was passed by the National Assembly in November of last year. And there's a few changes, key changes to the labour code, and I'll address those changes in this seminar. There's a list that's there, but I won't go through the list because it's going to be presented at the seminar anyway. So the first sort of thing I want to sort of focus on is labour contracts. Now, in Vietnam, all labour contracts, all sort of employment arrangements would now have to be in form of writing, unless it's a labour arrangement where it's less than 1 month. Then you can have a verbal arrangement, a verbal labour contract, but predominantly all labour contracts have to be in writing. There is provision which provides that if there are exchanges of contracts by electronic means, then those sort of data messages or SMS or even sort of email sort of discussions can form an employment relationship as well. One important element of the new labour code is in relation to employment and employment contracts. So under the labour code, you're deemed to have an employment relationship if you have a job, and if you have pay, and if you're under a direct supervision and management of another person. So if those arrangements are in place, irrespective of what the agreement or document is called, that arrangement is classified under the new labour code as an employment arrangement, and you're subject to the provisions of the labour code and labour law in Vietnam, and that has implications. Matt will talk about a number of those implications, particularly in work permits. But it also means that you know, a lot of employers who hire and who manage employees under a service contract, for instance. So service contracts are widely used as an alternative to a labour contract. Even if you have a service contract, and that's is deemed under the new labour code as a labour contract, and you're subject to the new labour code. So query whether you know, in terms of you know, in the tech field where you have the shared sort of economy sector of you know, your drivers, your scooter drivers, you know, Go Viet and others, whether they might be subject to the regime of the labour code. So it's important to, in those sectors, to see how you prepare your arrangement to make sure that, you know, for the purposes of the labour code, you might not want to be covered by the labour arrangement under the labour code. So have a look at those work arrangements, particularly in the tech sector, so that you're not caught. The new labour code also has provisions in relation to the term of the labour code, term of the labour contract. Generally, labour contracts have indefinite term and definite term. So definite terms are your employment contracts where there is a X period in which you're employed. Under law, you can't have a term of a labour contract for more than 36 months. So there's those two general types of labour contracts. So in the past, if you had a definite term contract and if you renewed those contracts twice, then it's automatically converted to an indefinite term contract. Under the new labour code, generally, if you renew once, the second renewal of your definite term contract becomes an indefinite term contract. However, that provision doesn't apply to certain classes of employees. For example, a foreign employee under the new labour code can't necessarily be on an indefinite term contract. The employee would have to be on a definite term contract, which is equivalent to the term of his or her work permit. You can renew definite term contracts for a senior employee, subject to sort of health clearance. And if one of the employees is a part of the management board or the trade union management board, then you can renew the term of the labour contract for the period of the appointment of that person on the trade union board. So if the trade union board has an appointment term of 3 years and the definite term contract of that employee is 2 years, as an employer, you have to extend that contract for an additional 1 year. There are provisions on probation under the new Labour Code. Now, probation period is not compulsory, but a lot of employees use this in order to try out the employee and even the employee to see whether their new workplace is good for them. So you can have probationary periods in your contract. The key change under the Labour Code is the period of probation. So previously, across the board, it's generally 2 months is accepted as the probation period for many jobs. Now, the new Labour Code provides that if you're in a managerial position, you're a general director, and other sort of heads of departments, for example, your probation period is 180 days. So it gives the company a bit more time to see whether that management employee is capable of the job, and 2 months might not necessarily be an appropriate period of time. For most jobs, yes, it's still 2 months, 60 days. For jobs that are at college or higher education level, it's 2 months probation period that you're able to agree to in your in a probation contract or employment contract. And for those who are at intermediate level technicians, for example, the maximum probation period is 30 days. There are changes in relation to the provisions on employment for foreign employees. As you know, foreigners can only be employed in Vietnam for a prescribed class of occupation. So they have to be experts, managers, executives, technicians. There are definitions of those under the law. There are also changes that's been proposed under regulations to implement the Labour Code to classify what the definition of managers, executives, experts, and technicians are. And these are under the current exposure draft. For experts, you'd have to have a number of satisfaction of criteria, one of which is you have to have a university degree with 5-year work experience and 3 years experience in the relevant sector, or you have a PhD, for instance. If you're executive, the executive has to be a manager of a department or organization, and she has to have 12 months working experience. So there's also definitions of technicians as well. So all these classes of occupation requires the foreign employee to have some level of experience and some sort of qualification and degree. In terms of work permit exemptions, Matt will be talking more about work permits, but one of the few exciting things about the changes is that if you're married to a Vietnamese, then you're exempted from the work permit regime, so you don't have to obtain a work permit. The other change is in relation to the number of times you can apply for a renewal of a work permit. So you can only apply for a renewal once, and then after that renewal, you have to get a new work permit. So more on details of the work permit will be discussed by Matthew. In terms of working hours and overtime, in Vietnam, the working hours have remained unchanged. It's 8 hours per day and 48 hours a week, although the government encourage you to employ your employees for 40 hours a week. But there are changes in relation to overtime. So overtime, if your employee works overtime, they can't work more than 50% of their daily working hours. So if they're working 8-hour shift, the overtime can't be more than 4 hours. There's a cap per month on 40 hours per month on overtime work, and 200 hours per month, 200 hours per year for overtime work. And there's exception for 300 hours in certain sort of occupation. The retirement age. Currently, the retirement age in Vietnam is 60 for males and 55 for females. Under the new Labour Code from 2021, that increases incrementally, 3 months per year for males and 4 months per year for females, with a eventual cap of 62 for males by 2028, and 60 years for female by 2035. There's also changes to the Labour Code provisions in relation to the type of occupation that you're in. So if you're in a high professional technical qualification occupation, then you can retire later, 5 years later. If your job is has a danger element to it, and your health and ability is declining as a result, then you can retire 5 years earlier. Leave and public holidays. In terms of personal leave, that's just a technical change under the new Labour Code in terms of personal leave for bereavement and personal leave for marriages. So it actually includes adopted kid, adopted child and adopted mother and parents in the definition of bereavement leave and marriage leave. And one other exciting change for many employees is that employees from 2021 will get an additional public holiday. So the National Independence Holiday, 2nd of September, you can choose to have an additional public holiday on the 1st or the 3rd of September. So in total, from next year, there will be 11 public holidays in Vietnam. Trade unions. One aspect of trade unions that's quite a significant change if you've got a large corporation and you're managing a lot of employees. Previously, you'd have to be affiliated if you've got a trade union. You have to establish a trade union if you've got more than 10 employees. And if you do, you'd have to be affiliated with the Confederation of Labour. That's a state agency. But with the new Labour Code, employees of an organisation can establish their own independent trade union, but it's still subject to registration for state authorities. And that's the good thing about that, though, is that there are a few things under the Labour Code where you need to get some sort of consultation, etc., with the trade union. So if the trade union is one that is within your organisation, it's probably a better outcome for the company to work with the trade union in your organisation rather than a state one that is part of the Confederation of Labour. So it's a good thing, good change. In terms of internal labour rules, as you know, every company needs to have an internal labour rule, and it has to be registered with the local Department of Labour, DELISA, of Labour and Valads. So in terms of the change in the new Labour Code, all sort of internal labour rule would have to have provisions in relation to sexual harassment and how you deal with those with sexual harassment, procedures to dealing with sexual harassment. So it's a good outcome with the change to make sure that there is no sexual harassment in the first place, and that's a focus of the new change under the new Labour Code. And it's clear and also in the new Labour Code that if employee sexually harasses another employee, it's grounds for dismissal. And as I previously indicated, with registration of your internal labour rules, you no longer have to consult with a grassroots level trade union before you submit the ILR with the DELISA. Termination of employment. Now, under the new Labour Code and Labour law, you can only terminate an employee for specific grounds as prescribed under the Labour Code. You can't agree for other grounds of termination. There are a prescribed set of termination grounds. And the new Labour Code extends the type of termination for an employer. One is if the employee has reached retirement age, if an employee fails to turn up to work for 5 consecutive days, and if an employee lied in his or her application of employment, then there's also a ground for dismissal or unilateral termination. For an employee, can also be terminated if their work permit has actually expired. So a key point there is foreign employees in the past can be employed under a indefinite term contract. These changes, a foreign employee can only be employed under a definite term contract. Now, in the past, there have been issues about employing foreign employees under an indefinite term contract, particularly those who are recalcitrant employees who would negotiate quite an unreasonable amount of settlement for termination. Under the new Labour Code regime, an indefinite term contract doesn't apply for foreign employees, so you don't get sort of hamstrung with those provisions. In terms of termination for an employee, now an employee can terminate for whatever reason he or she wants to, but he or she has to provide advance notice. So if that employee is on an indefinite term contract, it's 45 days advance notice. If that employee is under a definite term contract, it's 30 days advance notice. There's no advance notice if the result of the termination is through maltreatment, sexual harassment, or other prescribed matters. In terms of the period of notification or the period of notice period, it changes in relation to the type of job that you have, and under current draft decree, if you're a member of a flight crew, or if you work in the aircraft maintenance sector, or if you hold a managerial position, then if you want to end your employment, you have to give 120 days notice in advance if you're on a indefinite term contract, or if you're on a term of 12 months or more. So a longer notice period is required if you're an employee who hold those types of special jobs. And that's still under a draft consideration at the moment. That concludes my summary of the key changes. Questions, I guess, will be left to the end, and I'll hand it over to Simon.
Great, thank you very much, Minh. Certainly a lot of information there, and we have had some people asking about the information, which will be available via the recorded version of our webinar today on Facebook, also our website, and via our e-newsletter, which will go out this afternoon. And as I stated earlier, if you do have any questions that you'd like to give either during the event or at the end, please use the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Basically, I'd like to move along to Matt Lourey, who's the Managing Partner for Domicile Corporate Services. Matt's a qualified accountant who's lived and worked in Vietnam for over 14 years. He assists foreign invested companies to enter Vietnam and ensures that ongoing accounting, tax, reporting and compliance needs are maintained at international levels and to meet Vietnam's standards. He also currently sits on a number of boards in Vietnam and advising as an independent non-executive director, and has been an active member of AusCham for a number of years as treasurer and previously as president before stepping down earlier this year. So I'd like to welcome Matt, who has some very interesting information which Minh alluded to as well during his presentation. So thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Simon. So I'm going to run through some more practical matters. So Minh's covered a lot of the technical side. I'll start on going on some practical sides, and it will lead into a lot of Q&A. So I suspect there'll be quite a few questions because there are some grey areas, there's some drafts, and also there are people trapped in various locations with our border closures. So we'll touch on those as we go through. So, and just Minh mentioned this, we've been doing this for a few years. It's actually the 5th year, Minh, that we've done, that Domicile has done this presentation with AusCham about the sort of the annual updates around this time every year. So just to flick through my presentation here, you've heard about me, it's okay, you don't need to do that. Quickly, Domicile, we've got 3 offices across the country, around 70 staff. Our clients are combinations of listed multinationals, private regional organisations, and individual consultants and individual professionals. So it's a very broad, sector-wise, very broad. And we do help with HR, we help with payroll outsourcing, tax, accounting, company establishment, transaction support. It's quite a broad range, and it is focusing on the foreign invested sector into Vietnam. We are part of a client which is a regional group, so we have sister offices across Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, and shortly into China, Japan, Korea as well. So we have a broad network that helps us make sure that we can do the cross-border matters successfully. The 4 main topics and how I'm going to structure this is we're looking at the immigration side, the visas, the temporary residence cards. We'll get back into work permits and some of the exemptions and some more sort of the detail behind those. And where they are now. A bit of just reminding people on taxation insurances, there's been a few changes, and just make sure interpretations, particularly for foreigners, is understood. And because there are some additional catches that people might get caught out on coming forward. And we'll look at what it means now. We'll finish the formal part about what's happening now with borders, what's happening with the authorities, and what it means. And that will lead us into the Q&A part of the discussion. So looking at immigration changes, particularly visa and temporary residence. So we've got the new laws that come into effect on 1 July. So we have the new law on immigration on entry, exit, transits and residence of foreigners. And that law has quite a few changes, and that is having sort of impacts on various, particularly small businesses. Examples that sort of exist at the moment are visas from 1 July can be changed in country. So traditionally, if you entered on a tourist visa, you'd have to exit, re-enter on a business visa in order to get a work permit. You can actually change visa types in country. Business visas can be up to 5 years in length. Temporary resident cards can be up to 10 years in length. Corporate investors can nominate an individual as their representative, where before that was only available to individuals themselves who were investors. And investor visas are now linked to the capital portion. So I'll go through those, but those changes are good, but also can be difficult, particularly, as I said, for the small investors. So let's look at the visa types. These are not all visas, by the way. There are many, many more categories, but we have now been, the DT visa, the investor visa has been split into 4 types. And so we're looking at DT1, which can have sort of a 5-year period as a visa. So this is not temporary resident cards, this is visas up to 5 years. So if you're investing more than 100 billion, $4.5 million US, you can have up to 5-year visa. DT2, more than 2 million, you can have 5 years as well. And the reason DT1 and DT2 are in there, you'll see for temporary residence cards why they differ. DT3 is a 3-year visa if you're above 130,000. But a DT4, which is a large number of individual investors starting with owning a consulting company, establishing a business, will have less than 130,000 capital. And they are no longer entitled for their 2 or 3 year visas, temporary resident cards before. They are restricted to a 12-month business visa. And that's going to be interesting for some. So the another interesting one there I noticed, and Min, I was mentioning to Min earlier, for some reason lawyers have been singled out. So lawyers now are only entitled to a 12-month business visa, and that they've been singled out and discriminated against. I don't know what lawyers have done wrong, Min. They're great for the country. I think we need to support the lawyers, but so they have done some things, but they've also introduced electronic visas in the law, and they was not in the law previously. So you'll see the electronic visas. There was a release a few weeks ago, which the media assumed borders were going to open. That was simply linking the e-visa system to the new law, and that was misinterpreted by the media. So the e-visas are now in law as opposed to a pilot program they were running in the past. So temporary resident cards. Temporary resident cards is sort of what most people, business people in Vietnam want to have. It gives much more flexibility with bank accounts, with registering a motorbike or a car, with a range of things of traveling using that as the ID. So the changes as we see it at the moment is that a temporary resident card can be up to 10 years for DT1. Those with more than $4 million can have a 10-year temporary resident card, including the representative of a corporate investor. Temporary residence cards can be 5 years if you're a DT2, so more than $2 million, amongst others, which some other category types, non-government and other specific types that most people wouldn't come across. NNs are family, NNs are family and for spouses and TTs as well. They can be 3 years, but also the DT3, $130,000 plus. And temporary residence cards for LD1, LD2, which is your work permit situations, 2 years. So the DT4, the investors with less than 130,000 are no longer entitled to temporary resident card. So they would need to either go on a 1-year business visa or get their residence by virtue of their work permit. And we'll touch on that when we get to work permits. So what are the implications of these changes to investors? So the small investors, less than 130,000 US dollars, don't have that, as I mentioned. And the benefit for very large investors is that they can have a temporary resident card or their representative in most cases. I don't think too many individuals who invest more than $4 million, but you have these 10 years. And that gives this certainty for the larger investors, gives them certainty, allows investors to come in and out and spend time. So it disadvantages the small, and it focuses on the government's prioritising of large investment. They want the money, they want to have larger investments, and this is one of those ways to stop people abusing the system and to stop people putting their name on a licence simply to get a residence card because their name on an ERC. That will no longer be available for small investors. Other changes, so tourist visas, this may catch out those who do border runs. So tourist visas are limited, even though it can be a 3-month tourist visa, each visit is limited to 30 days, but you can extend that in country by getting it stamped at the authorities. That means that the authorities are aware of who is here and what's going on and extending in country. And we haven't seen guidelines whether after 90 days or 3-month visa that they have to depart Vietnam or they are able to apply for an extension and a new visa in country. It'll be interesting what happens there. But they're trying to limit the ability to use tourist visas for long stays. And there are people who have been here a long time in Vietnam using tourist visas because they have been easily extendable in border runs. This may be, this will limit that at least and reduce the ability. And business visas are more strictly controlled. The sponsorship process and the requirements for the business visa is more linked to the purpose of that person's. Therefore, it's not going to be as easy to use a third party as a sponsor, a visa agent, etc. It would need to be a definite purpose with a business that is sponsoring someone, and therefore the authorities have more data on why someone's here, and that will impact on tax, impact on other matters as well. So it's the under the radar approach of visas in the past will be less so under the new law. which leads into the work permit side of things. So the new labour law from 1 January, so the new immigration law was from 1 July, the new labour law is from 1 January. So this is what Minh had gone through. But look at what that means for the work permits. So as Minh said, all foreign individuals looking to work in Vietnam are required to hold a work permit or an exemption certificate prior to undertaking any work in Vietnam. Now, the employer applies for the work permit or the exemption certificate for a specific role for that employer. So you can have multiple work permits. And the interesting is if you have a work permit for a role, the current law and the new law allows a much easier process to then apply for another work permit in an organisation for the same role. So if you've already qualified and they've passed you, it is actually a much easier application. You can get to bypass a lot of the requirements. So the government's not making it difficult. They just do require you to have a work permit in each role. So if you are doing the same job for 5 companies, you have one primary application, and then you can roll that for 4 other applications quite easy using the same lodgement documents without having to do a complete application. Now, from the work permit exemptions, we'll touch on what they are in a moment, but there are 2 exemptions that were available that did not require a work permit exemption certificate. One of them was this 90-day rule, and that was designed for people traveling to Vietnam to look at bids, offer services, traveling salespeople. Now, people use that 90 days for a whole range of reasons, but in the past, it was there. And also the 30 days per visit, 90 days a year for technical experts. Now, they don't require an exemption certificate in advance. Now, the new Labour Code changes that. So we'll go through it in a moment, but that exemption, that 90-day exemption is not really available, and quite commonly the work being done under that service contracts, etc., under 90-day exemption would be caught as an employment contract. For the penalties for working in Vietnam without a labour contract includes deportation for up to 3 years. It includes fines, operational suspension, and exclusion from employing foreign employees from employers. So it's quite strict. We do know that deportations have been happening, and whether more happen under the new law, we'll see. So let's look at some of the exemption categories first. So who is exempt from a work permit? So under the old Labour Code, if you invested in a company, you're exempt. Under the new rule and the draft decree, you can a work permit only if you contribute $1 billion, 43,000. So not only do you cannot get a temporary resident card under the immigration rules, you're actually, if you don't put a $1 billion in, you're also not entitled to work permit exemption as an investor. So investors have been double hit here. Small investors have been double hit. Their residency have been restricted and their work permit exemption. So that is an impact. Members of board and directors of joint stock companies will also be impacted. Now, the draft decree doesn't explicitly say that they'll be stuck to the same requirement, but just being on a board of directors will no longer by itself give you the exemption for a work permit. You've got heads of representatives, then can be exempt, and if they take charge of operations, subtle difference there. We'll see what that means in the final implications, but they have changed that. You've got the foreign individuals for 3 months, 3 months, the 90-day rule. However, if you wish to use that 90-day rule, you must advise the authorities 3 days prior to commencing and that you're going to be using that. So the authorities will know every person who is trying to use the 90-day exemption prior to them using it. If not, you're in breach of the Labour Code. And so that's also tightening. So not only the definition of a labour contract, employment contract, and is being tightened, and so service contracts are not as feasible as before. The exemption that sits there is going to be a problem to utilise. Foreign lawyers will be still granted work permit exemptions, Minh, so you're okay for working. Foreign individuals with various treaties. Students can no longer be work permit exempt because they're a student under the new law, which is interesting. That so they can study, but they can no longer work as an exemption. They would need a work permit. And as Minh suggested, there is the foreign employees who are married to a Vietnamese individual and live in Vietnam. We haven't seen the full guidance about what requirement for that, because this is applicable to quite a number of people, but we understand that provided they have a temporary resident card registered and they're living in Vietnam with that temporary residence card, that would likely be one of the key factors. So those on visa exemption certificates may not satisfy. So probation period. So Minh talked about probation, how important they are. From a practical point of view, it has been a problem in the past because probation forms part of an employment relationship. Therefore, you can't sign the probation agreement or the labour contract until they have a work permit. And a work permit takes time to exercise. So a lot of people use that 90-day period in the past to arrange for the work permit and to treat that as a probation period. As we said, that's no longer available. So that's going to be from 1 January, much more difficult. So that, and with most service contracts or interim measures still going to be deemed as labour contracts in court under the law, that most people will need to be, after an offer is accepted, arranging a work permit and not working or not having signed documents or alternative arrangements. It will be very difficult just to offer it for a foreign employee, get the acceptance, put them straight in the office to start work on Monday. There's going to have to be a time and a process for everyone to get their documents in order before that can proceed. The new law, by the way, the decree does not require filing of the employment contract when signed. The current law requires that within 5 days of a work permit to sign the contract and submit to the authorities. The new law removes that. It just says you need to provide to the draft decree says that you can provide that if they ask. So we'll see what that means. The good thing is, though, even though this removes the probation, you've got to get the work permit for probation, as Minh has discussed, potential probation periods can be longer for senior staff, so that you might have to bite the bullet and just do the work permit, but you have the ability for probation to deal with that and not be stuck with someone who hasn't worked out. So it's just going to be a work permit process, not stuck with a longer term contract as a result. Very simple diagram of the work permit process for those who don't know. There's the initial application to the Melissa or Provincial People's Committee, basically from the company saying we have a need for foreign employees. This is what we need. This is what we're after. Once that is approved, takes around 15 days. You then submit to the local Department of Labour in the province where the employer is based for the individual. So it's I need foreign employees. Yes, it's approved. Okay, now I wish to employ this individual. So that the employment lodgement of the individual documents, and it's less than 15 working days, by the way, it's much less than that now, but there's a process involved and you get the work permit. 2 steps, company, and then the company wanting employees, and then they want that individual employee. We generally find that that process works quite well if you've got your documents. It doesn't seem to be a big headache in getting work permits in practice in Vietnam. The headache is getting the documents for it or getting buy-in from everyone that they're necessary. So this is just an example of the documents that you'll need for an expert application. So an expert application is the most common. That is someone who has got a degree, got experience working. The new laws, by the way, when it comes to teachers were not part of Decree 11 and the old implementing decrees, and they were always treated with a separate set. The new decree, as I understand it, for the law, brings teachers back in and actually unifies the process. So we'll have one set of guidance. But general expert application, there is 7 elements that you need to consider. University degree, if you're taking the normal path, 3 years bachelor's degree relevant for the role, and it must be relevant. If you're a qualified aeronautical engineer and the job is to be working in a law firm, you're not going to be accepted because there must be qualifications relevant for the role. The experience must be 3 years, and that should be, say, actually 3 years managerial experience. As Minh says, there's a 5-year experience, but a 3-year managerial experience, which is what they focus on. And it must be 3 years experience either outside the country in writing, or it needs to be evidenced by work permits in Vietnam. You can't use experience in Vietnam if there's no work permit or work permit exemption certificate attached to it. Criminal check, you can home country or Vietnam if you've been here for more than 6 months. In practice, you can do a criminal check in Vietnam immediately when you're here, and the authorities generally accept that, but the law does say 6 months. A health check at a registered hospital, not more than 12 months old, and that should be done in the province, at a approved facility in the province that you're applying for the work permit for that individual. It is possible to do it out of province. In fact, it's possible to do it abroad, but it is far more practical and would encourage to do it in the province. Your passport and visa, job description, because the job description must tie in with the experience, must tie in with the degree, and then the draft labour contract. So all of those documents are required part of the package before you can lodge. Now, with the authorities, they are quite flexible. You can have discussions with them. You can actually talk with them about will things be accepted. So people sort of fear that. They are quite helpful, so that you should know before lodging documents whether they'll work. If we're the ones we've been involved with, we don't really get rejections. The authorities do help, and so that there is a process you can go through. So it shouldn't be as intimidating as people think it is. Some of the issues, particularly getting the experience certificate. So that experience certificate, the senior managerial experience, you can either do the letter from previous employees abroad or previous Vietnam work permits. So the two issues coming through, that foreign documents must be notarized, legalized, consularized. They must go through a foreign process to authenticate them for Vietnamese purposes. And that can be difficult. It can involve 3 to 4 steps and 3 to 4 foreign offices. It could be a notary public or a justice of the peace. It could be have to go to a high court. It may have to go, then we'll go to the embassy. It may go to another location first. And every country is different. And getting those documents when you are out of country is not the easiest. Particularly when you've left an employer in not good terms, or the employer doesn't exist. I've got previous employees in Australia many years ago that have been merged, and that employer that I would have does not exist in some cases, and it would be very difficult to get documents. The other one is previous work permits. Now, historically, the work permit had to be handed back. They don't anymore. The authorities, they don't automatically expire anymore. They just become invalid, but they don't technically get withdrawn, and you don't have to return them. But that's recent. Now, prior, you always had to return those. There was an impost on the employer, and there was an obligation. So you couldn't keep the original work permit. Therefore, how do you show an original document or notarized proof that you've got a Vietnamese work permit? So the authorities, and they didn't have a database. They still, for some reason I don't understand, don't have a database they can access. So they did accept old copies for previous older work permits, but if it's a new work permit, they want the original, because the expectation is the employee can keep it now. But a lot of employers still follow the rule that they want it back. They feel it's their property, they paid for it. And so that is an issue, trying to satisfy, what we need to do for the work permits. That's your work permit. A work permit exemption almost looks the same as that, blue cover. So just for those who don't have them and don't see them, that's your work permit. Another thing I'd touch on is that we get quite commonly asked about foreign currency, and I see this issue before, you can't do foreign currency, you can do foreign currency. I'm referring to USD, which is the most common, but it can be any foreign currency. You can have that, but you must have a work permit before you can sign a contract with a foreign currency. The only exemption in that Circular 32 is for foreign employees with a work permit can sign a contract with foreign currency. Now, the key here is that payment should be made, or needs to be made, in the currency stated in the work permit. So it's not just I've got a US dollar contract, I'll pay in VND. That's not in compliance. So if there's a USD contract, then you're paid in USD. So HR and payroll teams don't like that, because they've got to do calculations every month in conversions. And yes, it's not easy. So it does provide different imposts, because all your calculations must be converted into VND for internal calculations, for insurance calculations, for tax calculations. So it does create an impost. And so there is that discussion whereby is needed. Now, given that a foreign individual who has tax paid income from salary can send that out of country and convert it without restriction to themselves. So if I'm receiving V&D salary, I could go to my bank and transfer to my foreign bank account in my name and convert the same as I can send foreign currency to my bank account abroad. Provided it's tax paid from a work permit, that conversion is not an issue. So it's a currency risk, but there's not a transfer issue. And that leads us on to taxation. Touch on taxation. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It's not the focus, but there are some changes to be aware of and just some clarity. So tax rates have not changed. However, that your personal deduction, your tax-free threshold, has increased for every individual from 9 million to 11 million, effective for payrolls from 1 July. But that increase applies for the entire year. So for your payroll for the first 6 months, you'll actually have a credit to be able to claim back when you do your tax finalisations. For your employer from 1 July, they will be requiring, they will be having a higher tax-free threshold or a personal allowance, personal deduction, and that you will get lower personal income tax on your salary. It's not going to be a big amount for most people, but there is going to be amounts. So if you're earning more than 11 million dong, you will get a benefit of some sort from the process. If you have dependents, so the dependent deduction increases as well. So if you've got a number of children, if you've got some elderly parents, if you've got, personal deduction, these can add up. So this could be quite a large deduction for quite a number of people. So employers need to make sure that their payroll calculations, their spreadsheets, their software changes to do that, and that individuals can know that they'll get a potential refund in the future. Just aware that foreign employees who have work permits, unless they're in a particular exemption category, will need to make sure they're paying their health insurances, their social insurance for foreign employees, which is social insurance is still only 3.5% until 2022, and the individual doesn't pay anything, and that no unemployment insurance is paid. Without unemployment insurance being paid, severance allowances will be payable for foreign employees when they finish employment because they have not had unemployment insurance. So employees need to keep that in mind, that there is a payout at the end to compensate for no unemployment insurance for foreign employees. Let's look at non-tax residents. I mentioned residents, then I'll touch on that. There is a 20%. So if someone is a non-tax resident, even though they have a work permit, if they don't meet residency, it's a flat 20%. And no insurances, no deductions, it's flat 20%. How does that be? Well, they need to meet the requirements. Now, with borders being closed, it's much easier to determine than it was before. So tax residency is someone who's 183 days in country, measured from the first day they arrived or in the tax year that they are currently in. Or if they have a permanent, or if they have a temporary resident card, they are tax resident, or if they rent a house for more than 6 months. With the fact that borders being closed since March, it's going to be very soon of your tax resident in Vietnam if you're here. There's no other way around it. But traditionally, if someone was in and out of the country a lot, and they were working on business visas, and the fact that they have a work permit did not necessarily make them a tax resident. And that can be confusing, and particularly when they trip over from non-tax resident to tax residents. Non-tax residents, only Vietnam sourced income, tax residents, global income. Double tax agreements can affect that, and outside the discussion here. We often see this 10% withholding, service contracts in particular. Now, there's no 10% tax rate, straight tax rate. The 10% is a withholding. It is a prepayment, and people sometimes get confused. So there will be top-ups or refunds when finalisations are occurring. So if you're doing a 10% withholding because of a service contract, that may be okay for this year, may not work in the future, as Minh talked about, but just be aware that this 10%, and particularly the employees receiving and individuals, you still need to do your finalisation. You still need to make sure that you're paying the correct taxes. It is a prepayment, a withholding in respect of your taxes. Finalisations. So individuals in receipt of salary or service income are required to submit annual finalisations with authorities where they owe taxes or wish to claim a refund. And your employer, if you have one employer, can do that for you. If you have multiple employees, you must do that yourself. And finalisations are required within 90 days. You can do it later than that if you don't owe any money, but if you owe money, you must do it within 90 days. Now, in the past, not everyone did finalisations. It was sort of, I've paid the right tax, it doesn't matter. Now, there's a few reasons that people must do it. One is there'll be a credit for this year, for the 2020, for the personal income tax, the rates that have changed for the personal deduction. And the second reason is that, that if you want a refund in the future, the authorities are generally requiring everyone to have done the prior year finalisations before they'll start giving out refunds. So people are finding to get a refund in the current year, they've got to go back and do a number of years of finalisations at the same time. So to avoid any potential problems, we really encourage everyone to either use your employer to finalise or self-finalise every year. The other one is for an employers that if the employee leaves and doesn't finalise their tax and owes taxes, the employer can be, under the current law, is responsible. So the laws do put pressure on for employees to make sure their taxes are finalised. So Keep in mind that it doesn't have implications most of the time for employees, particularly when they're terminated and leave the country, but it may have implications if there's a large tax bill or if they're doing other activities and have taxable income that you may not have been aware of, but you'll need to settle. And another law change that's happening on 1 July was that the tax authorities, in conjunction with immigration, there's now the ability for individuals to be prohibited from leaving Vietnam where tax obligations have not been met. In the past, there was no explicit ability. Now there is an explicit ability in the tax administration that there's a connection between the authorities. So I've mentioned earlier about all the visas starting to give transparency with these tax laws and integration with immigration and this process for work permits. It's becoming much more integrated. And as a result of that, you will find that the authorities are much more aware. In the past, people have lived years and years slipping through the net. This will become harder. So this is becoming much more connected in how the authorities are dealing with things, much more online. So one of the benefits of COVID has been a renewed focus on online, on submissions online, doing everything online. This is now coming through. And so the more topical part, what's happening now with COVID-19 border closures, work permits, visas, what's going on? We all know there are people separated around the world. We know people who are wanting to get into Vietnam, and let's see what's going on at the moment. So the good news, work permit applications are now being accepted this week. So we have lodged applications ourselves, our firm, and we have seen plenty of other applications being lodged and accepted. The difference is that if Ho Chi Minh City now, a few differences from some of the rules I've gone through right now on the Prime Minister's instructions and the People's Committee's instructions following that, they're accepting, but they require the health check to be permitted in Vietnam, and they require the original passport. So if someone's not currently holding a work permit and they're out of Vietnam, according to the Ho Chi Minh City rules, they would not be in a position to apply until they've re-entered Vietnam. COVID tests are required for those who are outside Vietnam after 7th of March, and health checks can be 12 months old per the requirements, but if the individual has travelled outside Vietnam, they need a new health check for the date, any date after they've returned. A good thing is that work permit renewals can have continued, and we have achieved them where the individual is not in, who is trapped outside Vietnam. When the law has always allowed for foreign health checks, but the process has been confirmed where we have managed to obtain health checks that have been approved by the authorities. Some countries it's quite hard, but we have managed to do that as well. So if you have yourself or have people that are trapped outside of Vietnam, you can do a renewal for your work permit if you have an existing work permit that has not yet expired. Visas and when are the borders opening? So Vietnamese borders are currently closed and are only open to Vietnamese citizens returning, foreign diplomats and foreign experts. There are no inbound commercial flights as of today. There may be some soon, but we have not got clarity. There's hope, but there is definitely no certainty on when they will resume, but there's no inbound commercial flights. And any inbound flights that are arriving empty unless they're government repatriation flight. So they're flying in empty cargo and they're flying out with passengers. So there are outbound flights, just not inbound flights. Beware that if you are booking a flight in the first week of July and hoping that it will arrive in Vietnam, my guess is that you're going to be getting an airline credit and that those flights will not be arriving. So just you don't need to be giving the airlines cash for their operations if there's limited likelihood of a flight taking off. Some Vietnamese nationals have been able to come back into the country, and a limited number of visas have been granted to experts for projects of national importance. We're talking Samsung, LG, Petro Vietnam, and others, but we're talking about 1,200 individuals I'm aware of that have, or slightly more than that, have come in through that process. And that is very much at a significant national scale that this is being done. They've been coming on charter flights too. 14-day compulsory quarantine, that's not going to be lifted, and that is up to the provincial authority to organise and arrange. So on the 29th of May, the Prime Minister directed the provinces to facilitate business visas and work permits for foreign experts where there's a need. So in the past, it came down to national importance. Now the focus has been moved to need. They realise there's gaps in the economy, gaps in businesses, so it's now need. Provinces are there to determine their own provinces, and it involves combinations with the Department of Labour in the province, recommending back the People's Committee, making submissions to immigration, and there's a process. That is still not clear. Ho Chi Minh City set out very clear guidelines. They wanted applications by the 8th of June. We haven't seen the results of applications that have been made. We're not aware of any which have been issued by any of the provinces, and Ho Chi Minh City is still accepting applications for need-based visas. We're not aware they've determined their quarantine facilities yet. I'm aware Hanoi has at one of the hotels, but we still haven't seen that. So it's very much a state of flux. And this is the main point, is the business visa will allow someone to come into Vietnam, get their work permit, get their temporary resident cards, etc. So visa renewals in country haven't been a problem. Temporary resident cards have been an issue, and they're not being available in Vietnam at the moment. Someone whose TRC expires is generally going on a 3-month or a 6-month business visa. But we're expecting, based on the Prime Ministerial directions, that to change any day now. And it may be now waiting till 1 July, the new immigration law, until they start issuing temporary residence cards under the new law. However, business visas in country continue so that no one has to be here illegally. They can use business visas for the time being. So we don't have clarity on visa issuances for important people. We do know the current processes that the authorities have in place for the application for business need for foreign employees is not for family. It only encompasses individuals who are coming here to work. I've seen people trying to bring their dogs. No, it is the individual only, and that is a problem because there are families split, there are people split that are different categories that have had exemptions and doing things in the past, visa exemption certificates. There's a range of people trapped. So this is a limited process. We have seen the authorities want to do it and expand this. So we basically keep an eye on the government announcements. It will change soon, but it's a state of flux. So work permits is very clear now. Visas and temporary resident cards and entry and border entry is still an unknown scenario. So that's my presentation. There's a lot of fast talking and a lot of things in flux and a lot of things happening, together with Min's more detail on the labour law itself. I think we're open to questions, and I'll throw back to Simon now to facilitate the questions that we have and any more that people wish to throw at us.
Just Simon and Matt, before we go on to Q&A, and I think that Q&A can be submitted through the panel at the bottom of the website. But I just want to mention, in terms of the efforts of AusCham, as you may know, we sent out a survey on Monday to see what the situation is like in terms of employees who are located outside of Vietnam and want to return to Vietnam, and seeing what the situation is. The survey is still available, and I think it is today. So if you haven't submitted your response to that survey, please do so by today. Now, the purpose of that survey is so that we can make representations to the Vietnamese government and the Australian government to allow business travel, to allow employees to travel back to Vietnam, where they are being employed, and that's where their residency has been. So we understand that there are a number of people in that situation. Current sort of preliminary raw data from the survey show that there are around 90% of those who were surveyed said that they have employees who are located offshore, who want to bring their family also back to Vietnam as well. So there are a number of issues that are out there that has not been resolved by governments. And as your chamber, we're going to try to make sure that your issues are being addressed and considered by the governments of both Australia and Vietnam.
Thank you, Minh. Very good point. There's been a lot of people responding to the survey that we've been running over the past week. It's a great initiative, and there's been some very interesting information coming back. I don't have many questions, but one question that was asked was probably directed to both of you, because it, on the legal side and also on the immigration side, but there's a lot of information going around at the moment, and people are wondering where is there any central location for updates online that might actually give you the most accurate, up-to-date information at any time during the next month or so?
I'll answer that. No, I wish there was. It would make our lives so much easier, because we are fielding, dozens of client queries on a daily basis trying to get that, because they can't find it, and it is frustrating. So unfortunately, there's not, and that's something I think is interesting for the chamber to take up, to see what can be done as an organisation to try to help the government bring that into a place. And I think part of the reason, and Min might be able to clarify, is that you've got a decision-making authority at a national level, but you've got implementation at a provincial level, and every province does have peculiarities and differences, and that does make it hard.
Totally understand. I had a question from Brian Schultz about work permits. Basically, he said they're building a desalination plant in Vietnam under a Vietnamese company. And if they need to travel back to assist with technical assistance, can he travel on an APEC card, and or is he going to need a work permit to be in the country for any length of time?
Do you want me to start with that one, Min?
Well, as a service provider, there will be difficulties for you. First of all, as Matt mentioned, to enter the country, you need to have the flights availability and things like. So, assuming that post COVID and you're able to fly into Vietnam, then yes, you're able to get sort of a number of visas. I think the most typical one is your business visa. I'm assuming that you'll be in Vietnam for less than 90 days, so you can come into Vietnam to sort of implement your installation. But if it's more than 90 days, then I'm not sure what your arrangement is. You might be governed by a foreign contractor arrangement, where you have a service agreement in place, so you have to register your foreign contractor arrangement with the authorities, and that allows you to get your extended visa more than 90 days, I guess. But there are arrangements in place to allow you to come into Vietnam post-COVID. But Matt might have more to say.
Yeah, the APEC card's an interesting one, where the authorities haven't addressed APEC cards in any of the discussions. So in this transition period, and as the borders move to opening up, we are seeing APECs left out. So that in the past, APEC was great, nice and easy to use. It's falling through the cracks. So I can't answer what's going to happen with that and when that returns to normal. As Min said, that should be, in theory, fine for entry up to that 90 days that APEC cards allow. But at the moment, in a transition period, there's no certainty what APEC would do and whether you would need to apply, because it's likely that the borders may stay closed for tourists and for those without approval for the rest of the year. It's potential, it's possible. There may be green channels, but it's quite possible. And in that case, it would need to be the employer would need to make application for why, or a Vietnamese company, to why a foreign expert is required and seek the business visa approval. So in the scenario, it might be that the Vietnamese contractor has to make application for the expert to come into country. Again, 14 days quarantine at the moment. That will obviously eventually be stopped at some stage, but all those issues. The work permit scenario, it's an interesting one. So the foreign contractor versus work permit and the various authorizations. So this is now it's sort of a muddled mess because of COVID, but there is coming more parts to play with. And I think beyond 2021, when all these laws have been implemented and we are moving out of a COVID scenario, it will be much, much easier. But for now, it is complicated.
No doubt, still very complicated. I have a question from Jess Wong, and this is to Min. Seasonal labour contract, you mentioned the seasonal labour contract will no longer be accepted as a labour contract. Can you share how to overcome short-term contract requirements when the new laws are passed?
Yeah, so that it's just a category of labour contracts in the past. So you can still enter into a short-term labour contract for whatever period that you're going to be employed in Vietnam. So, if you have a 3-month arrangement, then you enter into a labour contract for 3 months, and there will be a definite term contract for 3 months. And if you had to renew that then for another 3 months, then yes, that can happen. But once you renew that for 3 months, then you automatically, at the end of that period, you're automatically hired under a indefinite labor contract. Now, that's in the context of a Vietnamese employee, but if you're a foreign employee operating under a 3-month contract, you can still enter into sort of further definite term contracts. So essentially just your period of employment will be put into your labor contract as a definite term contract as opposed to a different category.
A 3-month work permit will be an interesting challenge there, Min, as well, but
yeah,
for a foreigner. So.
I have Daniel Tedesco, who's I've been speaking with recently as well, and I think that he's also responded to our survey with his situation. As their company is expanding, they're tend to be hiring a lot more people. But with all this happening, he's stuck in Melbourne. But there's he's sent me a lengthy question. I'm not sure if you can see that in the Q&A box, but he's talking about his TRC and work permit will expire in August. It seems more and more unlikely that he'll be able to return to Vietnam. So he really needs to make sure that both can be extended and how he can legally do that, and also it be paid in Vietnam, I gather.
So the first out of that is work permit. That work permit can be renewed from Australia. You start the process, there's the defined period, and it's a matter of the biggest implication is going to be getting the health check for the renewal, because the renewal requires the health check predominantly as the key document. So the renewal itself, copies, you can use copies of passports. If provided it's not a new work permit, they'll still accept copies. So yeah, do the work permit, and that continues that right, continues that that ability to be employed by and paid by there. It might be a tax resident or non-resident scenario, but the employment can continue. The TRC can't be renewed at this stage and will lapse, and a new business visa will need applying for to return to Vietnam when the borders are opening up under the current rules. Once back in Vietnam, a new TRC can be applied for. Now, that may change in the future, where we may be able to get TRCs before arrival, picked up from embassies or something like that. But at the moment, under the current scenario, it is for Daniel to extend the work permit, and just the TRC will expire, and at the first chance, he would be able to apply for the business visa to return.
Great, thanks, mate. I have another question. I'm not sure if this is correct, but are current temporary resident visas still available after 1st of July? I'm not sure why after 1st of July, but I think you might have spoken about that earlier.
Well, temporary resident cards. So a temporary resident card is a card of normally it's more than 1 year in length. And that's the blue card for temporary resident cards. The law says they're issued, and as I went through the whole categories where you can get them, so the whole bunch of categories up to 10 years, you can do them as family. So if your spouse has a work permit and a temporary resident card based on employment, you can get a family visa to match a family temporary resident card to match the employees, your spouse's temporary resident card, as can children. If you're married to a Vietnamese, you can get a 3-year temporary resident card. At the moment, they are not issuing those. So even though the law, they're quite clear that they're available, the authorities aren't, but they have been given directive to do that. So as I mentioned, I believe they'll start very soon with renewing them in country for those who are in country. And my personal belief is the withholding until 1 July, because it's easier just to start doing them under the new regime than to have a hybrid process. But time will tell whether that's the case. But I believe they should be coming out shortly. But today they are not issuing temporary resident cards in country or at all.
Thanks, Matt. This one is more focused on the labour code. So I'd imagine, Min, the person is asking, is there any change in determining the labour relationship of some kind of service agreement? An example, the service agreement between driver and app provider is actually put under management and control of the app provider. It's
yeah, that's a very interesting question. On sort of on the face of it, for you know, your GoVit and your other sort of Grab drivers, it doesn't seem to be covered as an employment contract, because there's a bit of autonomy in relation to how those drivers work. So I think, you know, I'm not sure in terms of the arrangements of each of those applications, but if they're being paid directly, for example, by the consumer, by the passenger, then as opposed to directly from Grab or GoVit, then that's a different story, because they're actually a service provider to each of the customer, as opposed to a service provider directly to the application, to the actual the tech company. So you just have to, in all of these arrangements, you just have to figure out, okay, who's the person being paid by? Is a regular payment? Are they, you know, are they working from a sort of a actual period of time from 9 to 5, for instance, or a set of period of time? What they do, the things that they do, and the instructions are directed by management, for instance. All those things you have to, you know, take into consideration in order to determine whether a labour arrangement is in place. But in relation to that sector, it's probably unlikely, because they're being paid by the consumer rather than the app. But there might be in the other tech sector where, you know, a lot of, for example, programmers, they are operating under the service agreement and they get regular payment from the current, from the company that they sign up to. So in those sectors, yes, it could trigger an employment relationship.
Because, I mean, there's this expectation in the community of freelancer as a profession, being a freelancer, signing service contracts, and that is going to change now. And for foreign individuals, I don't believe that right exists, because you need to be a business professional, or you need some connection. It's very hard. It doesn't say you can't, but it's very hard to prove that you would actually be able to enter into one of those service agreements for, and I call it a for result being an individual payment or an activity versus a true employment relationship. And so that freelancer concept is not only hard for a foreigner, almost impossible, it's going to change in the Vietnamese context.
Absolutely agree, yeah.
Thank you. I have another question from an Australian investor who's with an Australian listed stock company. Basically, have a casino in Lao Cai. So the question is, besides the tourist visa, what other option do they have for visiting Vietnam? Will an investor visa be available to them at any time?
So from a visa perspective, there's nothing stopping you on a tourist visa entering Vietnam and traveling around, visiting, inspecting. It's for the tourist visa is for non-work purposes. So that is the first thing. Now you've got to be careful of purposes, etc. But entering on a tourist visa by itself and driving around, visiting, and not undertaking any work, it's not necessarily prohibited. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's definitely a possibility. A business visa, there is the ability, and the law has it, and there's classification codes for people who are coming to Vietnam to make investments or potentially establish a company. What I don't know is what the sponsorship arrangements, because they've changed the arrangements post 1 July of who and how can sponsor that. So that is something I actually don't know the answer to, but the provision is there in law to allow for a visa and a visa category for up to 3 months to actually, and extendable for establishing and investing purposes. So that is probably the most appropriate category. And as an investor visa, though itself, simply being an investor in a joint stock company does not give you any rights to obtain any visas in respect. It has to be investment and named on an enterprise registration certificate, which you would not get as a joint stock company, or for a public company, a small company, yes, but not a public company. Minh, anything else you would add to that?
No, I think that's all, yeah.
Okay, so I currently don't have any other questions in the Q&A box, and just wondering if you'd probably want to summarise what we spoke about today, either or both of you, and if there's anything I'd like to add.
Well, I think on the labour law side, you've got around 6 months to prepare yourself. So, you know, think about how you address those changes in your workplace. You know, whether you need to take a look at your labour contracts, for instance, to make changes, whether you also probably have to amend your internal labour rules, for instance. Those things have to be done so that you're compliant with the new labour code.
And from my side, just to add on to that, apart from getting ready for the labour law, the changes there, it is just small investors, look at the options, look at whether you need to transition as your current work permit exemptions and temporary resident cards expire. If you're a small investor and you can't or not in a position to put more money into the company, to look at alternatives, look at getting your work permit and getting documents. They might be painful, but you might have to go through that normal process. Once you've done it once, it becomes just a process to relodge in the future. So I encourage small investors just to deal with the changes and move towards a sustainable long-term ability to stay in the country. Those who are trapped out of Vietnam and looking to get back in, keep an eye on the media, keep an eye on professional releases. There's no one source, but I'm expecting there'll be quite a few changes. The government is actively pushing the authorities to allow appropriate business people to come back in. But that's not so easy when you've got border closures, you've got issues with immigration, you've got issues with commercial flights. So they will start to resolve themselves later in the year. It is going to be difficult. Just keep an eye on things, but at the same time, don't let your work permit lapse. If you have a current work permit, even if you're out of country, renew it. It can be done, and that'll give you a better connection for justifying your return to Vietnam. If they feel the number of people who can come in, those with work permits would generally get a priority.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you, Minh. I think speaking today, there's been a lot of information, and there's been on both topics. And some people have been asking whether or not the presentation would be available. Basically, the recording of the webinar will be available on the AusCham website, also via e-newsletter today, and will be published to Facebook as well. So, and of course, one of the points that was made earlier is that where is the place to go for this sort of information, which is up to date and the most accurate. I think Matt alluded to the fact that it's changing constantly. It's something that isn't static, and this is something that we'll investigate as well. Minh also, the Australian Chamber of Commerce has been actively surveying members to get feedback on their situations and how we can also advocate to the government on their behalf to see what we can do. So the people who've been actively involved, I thank you, and the people that have survey to complete, we're certainly interested in hearing from you as well. But I think most of the time the best people to speak to be the two people that we've had presenting today. Minh Duong from Asia Counsel, and also Matthew Lourey from Domicile Corporate Services, two of the most experienced people, definitely in Vietnam, if not Ho Chi Minh City, and definitely on the Australian Chamber of Commerce. So I encourage you to reach out and contact both, and we can share their information with you on our website. It's already there, but beyond that, I think it's, as Matt said, it's a matter of actually keeping informed, looking for the information, keeping up to date, and doing whatever you can if your aim is to be back in Vietnam, basically on a day-by-day basis as we go. And I thank the speakers today, both Matt and Minh, for your time, and I thank everybody who's participated today with questions and also viewing. I don't have anything further to say other than to stay safe. I hope that we do meet again very soon, and that the questions that you might have will be answered very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Right. Bye.